Hi, my name is Terry McKinnell, and today I'm going to explain to you how I originally rectified the arrival of the Age of Aquarius. For those people who are not astrologers, rectification is really just another name for reverse engineering and is often used by astrologers when they do not know the time of birth for a person who comes to them for a horoscope. And therefore, without a time of birth, they need to look at the events in the people's life and then reverse engineer to work out which time will allow all these events to happen in correlation to their horoscope. And the same thing applies to the astrological ages. I first started to rectify the Age of Aquarius in 1987. I actually can remember very clearly the day I first had my epiphany about this, when all of a sudden it occurred to me, when did the Age of Aquarius arrive? And when I started thinking about this, I also worked out in my head a process of how I would do this. And I very quickly was thinking about this concept of vague borders. If you start reading about astrological ages, you will find that many astrologers will talk about this blurring of borders, that, you know, there's no such thing as a tight border between the Age of Aquarius and the previous Age of Pisces, or between any two ages. And so the conclusion they have come to is that you cannot say when the Age of Aquarius arrives. Now, this superficially is okay, but it has a great big problem, because nowhere else in astrology does this occur. When the sun and the moon and all the planets move, they move in degrees and minutes and seconds, and as soon as they go from 29 degrees, 59 minutes and 59 seconds, once they move that one more second, bingo, instantly it leaves one sign and goes to another sign. But for some reason, astrologers en masse have decided that this is not the case with the ages. And so I remember thinking to myself, this is absurd. Why should ages have vague borders? Why shouldn't ages be just like any other form of astrology? And then there is another issue that I'll briefly talk about, is that ages, such as the Age of Aquarius and the Age of Pisces, are not monolithic. They're not just bricks in a wall. There is not this Age of Pisces followed by the Age of Aquarius, followed by the Age of Capricorn and so on, because these ages have divisions. They have divisions of decans, where you can divide each age into 3 age decans. So if an age is around 2,150 years, it has 3 age decans of about 720 years each. The ages can also be divided into 1/12. Now, the common term for this is the Indian Hindu astrology word dwadasamsa, abbreviated to dwad. And so there's 12 dwads in each sign. The way that these dwads are organized is that always the first dwad, or the first 1/12 of any sign, is the same as the sign itself. Now, this is exactly complements decans, because the same situation happens with decans. So for instance, with the Age of Aquarius, the first decan of Aquarius is Aquarius, followed by Gemini, followed by Libra. If you look at the sign Aquarius and you want to divide it into 1/12 or dwads, the first 12th is Aquarius, followed by Pisces, followed by Aries and Taurus, and going all the way round and finishing with Capricorn. The other problem with the subdivision of signs is that most astrologers, when they subdivide ages, they will have the first subdivision of any age, such as the Age of Aquarius and Age of Pisces, Aries. So Aries becomes the first sub-age, followed by Taurus and Gemini. Apart from the absurdity that this Aries to Pisces subdivision of sign is not found anywhere else, there's also the problem that the fact that the ages go backwards through the zodiac. Now, especially if you're not an astrologer, you may not be aware that Pisces is considered the 12th sign, Aquarius is the 11th sign, Capricorn is the 10th sign, and we are moving from the Pisces age to the Aquarius age, and then from the Aquarius age to the Capricorn age and Sagittarius age. We are going backwards through the zodiac due to precession of the equinoxes. When I first considered using subdivisions of ages to work out when the age of Aquarius arrived, I naturally assumed that these subdivisions also went backwards through the zodiac like their parent age. And this is actually called the geometric approach. So when we look at these 1/12 sign subdivisions or dwads, the first dwad for any sign is always the same as the sign. So the first dwad of Aries is Aries, the first dwad of Taurus is Taurus, the first dwad of Gemini is Gemini. So if we were looking at, say, Gemini, we would say the first dwad is Gemini, the second is Cancer, the third is Leo, and it goes all the way around to the last dwad of Taurus. But because we're going through the ages backwards, we have a different process. And so when we look, say, at the age of Aquarius, the first dwad in Aquarius is Aquarius, and it goes all the way around and finishes with Capricorn. But because we're moving through the signs geometrically in the ages, the first dwad encountered in the age of Aquarius is Capricorn, followed by Sagittarius, and then Scorpio, and then Libra, and Virgo, and so on. At the end of age of Pisces, the last sub-age in the age of Pisces was actually Pisces, and before that was Aries and Taurus and Gemini, and so on. So when we apply the geometric application of dwads to the ages, what happens is, and I worked this out rather quickly, I think even when I was lying on my balustrade in the sun on that winter's day in 1987, that I realized that the last few, or the last two sub-ages to be encountered in the age of Pisces was going to be an Aries sub-age followed by a Pisces sub-age. Now these sub-ages are about 178 years long, and they are much more manageable than ages, which are 2,150 years. And this brings up another interesting point, that ages are overvalued, because to find the common thread that runs through an age of 2,150 years, it has to be very thin, because any 2,150 years in history, especially in the last 5,000 or 7,000 years, a hell of a lot happens. And so to actually think that everything is just aligned to this one age for this whole time is a little far-fetched. When you start talking about sub-ages of 178, 179 years, we are talking at much more manageable periods of history that correlate much easier to historical events. So what I realized back in 1987 is that what I needed to do was try and see if I can find the Aries sub-age and the Pisces sub-age at the end of the Pisces. Now, this was based on the assumption that we were, in fact, already in the age of Aquarius. And this is an assumption, and it was an unproven assumption to me in 1987. However, I was of the opinion that Aquarius had to be around. I mean, Aquarius rules democracy, it rules electronics, it rules flight, and it was just so bizarre to think that the whole advent of the modern world, and that's another thing that Aquarius rules, is modernity, could occur without the age of Aquarius also occurring. So even though at that stage in 1987 I could not prove that the age of Aquarius arrived, I kind of assumed that it had arrived. And so my sort of feeling was, well, what I should do is look for the last few sub-ages in the age of Pisces, and perhaps even look at the first few sub-ages in the new age of Aquarius. Now, the first few sub-ages in the age of Aquarius is the Capricorn sub-age, followed by the Sagittarius sub-age, followed by the Scorpio sub-age, and so on. And what I did was I actually got 2 pieces of cardboard. On one piece of cardboard, I copied out historical events from my encyclopedias, like, the Renaissance and the Age of Maritime Exploration and the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment and all manners of major historical events that you can find in any history books. And this was put on this piece of cardboard to scale to century. So I had century marks. But on the other piece of cardboard, I put in the same scale the end of the age of Pisces and the beginning of the age of Aquarius, marking in the Aries sub-age, the Pisces sub-age at the end of the age of Pisces, and then the Capricorn, Sagittarius, Scorpio, and Libran sub-ages at the beginning of age of Aquarius. And what I did with these 2 pieces of cardboard is move them and try and get them to line up. Now, I remember, this was probably 4, 5, or 6 weeks after my initial epiphany lying in the winter in 1987. And I remember it did not work when I tried to line up major historical events and periods on the one sort of cardboard with the other. It wouldn't work because I was working on the assumption that the age of Aquarius kind of had recently arrived, which is, by the way, what most people think. Most people, and in fact in America, it's urban legend or an urban myth that the age of Aquarius lasted 20 years from the 1960s and 1970s. And I kind of thought, well, maybe the 1960s and 70s was the start of the age of Aquarius, even though I knew the age of Aquarius didn't last for 20 years and lasted much longer. So then when I couldn't get these to line up, I became very radical. I did a lot of extra movement, which I just thought was crazy. And then all of a sudden, click, all the historical events lined up with fairly standard archetypes associated with the Aries sub-age and the Pisces sub-age and the Capricorn sub-age and the Sagittarius sub-age and the Scorpio sub-age. This completely shocked me because the only way you can get an alignment between these sub-ages and historical events is if the age of Aquarius arrived in the 15th century. There is no other century the age of Aquarius can arrive to get the sub-ages at the end of the age of Pisces and the beginning of the age of Aquarius to align with historical events using fairly conventional archetypal associations with the signs. And so what I'm going to do now is really just trace through with you and show the historical events, well, to show you the major historical events that occurred in the Aries Pisces sub-age at the end of the age of Pisces, followed by the Capricorn, Sagittarius, Scorpio, and even Libra sub-age in the new age of Aquarius. I will not get into the exact details of how I worked out what exact year the age of Aquarius arrived in, but let me just say to you that in the same way that ages have 3 age decans, and that it also has 12 sub-ages, each of the sub-ages also have 12 micro-ages of about 15 years each. And these micro-ages have 12 nano-ages of about 15 months each. And even they can be divided into nano-age decans of about 5 months each. And these nano-ages can also be divided into pico-ages of about 5 weeks each. Now, you can't do much with a 5-week pico age, let me tell you, because everything's rather fuzzy down at that level. But certainly 5-month nano-age decans are easy to correlate to unfolding events and developments in historical events in the world, and especially the stock market. So if I can find a 5-month period that is correctly aligned to historical events, followed by the next 5-month period, and so on, then I know I've got a correct rectification. Now, it actually arrived in 1433. And it's like, shock, horror, 1433. Now, let me tell you something very interesting, that if you go to Wikipedia and you look up the word modernity, they will tell you that modernity appeared in the 15th century. They may call it early modernity, but nevertheless, modernity appeared in the 15th century. And it's only because of that early modernity that arrived in the 15th century that humanity were able to send a rocket with people to the moon in the 1960s and 70s. And yet people think, the Age of Aquarius commenced in the 1960s and 70s. Well, how can you have an age beginning in the middle of an age? It's absurd. Yet most people still think that this is when the Age of Aquarius arrived. What I'm going to demonstrate to you here, however, is what I first encountered and what I first discovered way back in 1987. And this related at that time exclusively to sub-ages. Even at that time, I wasn't using age decans. I was just using sub-ages. And I was thoroughly convinced and remain thoroughly convinced that these sub-ages accurately trace historical events commencing in 1072 with the Aries sub-age, and I think you'll agree with me once we go through this presentation that I am in fact correct. Now, when we think of the Aries sub-age, which ran from 1072 to 1253 AD, we need to have a fairly clear idea about some of the major associations, archetypal associations to Aries. And so I'm very clearly in stating that Aries is the sign of war, weapons and new beginning. So what do we find that happened between 1072 and 1253? We find that for the first time in the world, gunpowder was used to propel missiles in China. Now, gunpowder and missiles is classic association to Aries, and so no one can disagree that this is a major Aries development. Next, we have Genghis Khan. Now, he was born around 1162 and he died in 1227, clearly within the Aries sub-age. Now, many people may not be totally aware of Genghis Khan, but Genghis Khan was called the conqueror of the world. Now, back in those days, if you were living in the Eurasian landmass, that was the world. You may have had a little bit of an inclination of, North Africa and whatever, but no one knew the whole world. And why Genghis Khan is so famous is that he conquered more of the Eurasian landmass than any other person before or afterwards. Another major military exploit was the Crusades, when the Europeans, under the Pope, decided to invade the Middle East to rescue the Holy Lands from the infidels. Not everything associated with this Aries sub-age in 1072 to 1253 was related to war, just most things. But in Europe, there was an urban renaissance, especially in Italy, which was the home, obviously, of the Roman Empire. And this occurred from about the year 1100 onwards. And this was the first urban renaissance in Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire. And this is something that Aries is associated with, is energy, new energy, revitalized energy. Something that I haven't introduced to you yet in this video is the fact that ages, age decans and sub-ages are not bricks in a wall. They are waves. And it's all got to do with the fact that everything's going backwards. The ages go backwards, the age decans go backwards, the sub-age go backwards. But if you remember what I said before, is that the last age decan, for instance, in the Age of Aquarius is the Aquarius age decan. The first one is the Libra one, which we're in now. Then it goes to the Gemini one for about 720 years, and then it goes to the Aquarius one. And what does that tell you? Very clearly that the Age of Aquarius is going to be stronger in its Aquarianness at the end, the last third of the age, compared to this third. Now, this applies to all the periods and sub-periods in the astrological ages. Everything is at its highest strength at its end, and it's at its weakest at its beginning. So when the Age of Aquarius arrived in 1433, it is in fact very weak compared to the Age of Pisces, which just is coming to an end. The Age of Pisces is peaking in 1433. And these peaks do not just disappear or dissipate like a mirage. They behave like a tsunami and they wash over the next period. So while we're sitting here many centuries within the Age of Aquarius, the tsunami from the Age of Pisces is washing over us and is having a greater influence upon the world compared to Aquarius. They're both influencing the world quite a lot, but Pisces remains very strong, and we can see it quite clearly. Pisces has got to do with medievalism, and you can see that even on the international political arena, medievalism is a very strong component. We have Pisces religions, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism. All these different religions are still having major effects in the world. People are still killing and attacking each other based on their religious beliefs. This is due to the overflow from the Age of Pisces. So when I just discussed with you the Aries sub-age, that's really not the extent. It's actually just the first half, because once the Aries sub-age comes to an end, it then washes over the next sub-age while the next sub-age is getting its act together. So when we look at 1253 to 1433, the following sub-age after the Aries sub-age, what I would call the Aries sub-age overflow, 1253 to 1433. So what was happening? First of all, we have the 100 Years' War from 1340 to 1453. This 100 Years' War was between England and France. Now, this did occur at a time when the differentiation between England and France, including its borders and even cultures, was not as clear-cut as it is today. It was very debatable back then where France ended and where England started. But nevertheless, this 100 Years' War kind of solved that issue, because by the end of it, it was quite clear that England was England and France was France. But the mere fact that it went on for 100 years tells you that Aries is very strong, because Aries always promotes war. And even in this time, the ideal woman, and women are not normally associated with Aries, they're more usually associated with Venus, Libra and Cancer. The ideal woman of this period wore armour, and that was Joan of Arc, who lived from 1412 to 1431 before being burnt at the stake by the British, another Aries event. But as I was saying before, Aries is not only associated with warfare. We also have the beginning of modern Western painting. The Italian Giotto, born around 1266, about a decade inside the new Aries sub-age overflow, who lived to 1337, is considered to be the founder of modern Western painting. Until Giotto, medieval painting was almost like Egyptian painting, very flat and, not multi-dimensional. Very sort of basic painting. But with Giotto, we start to see the appearance of modern painting. Also in 1397, we find that ancient Greek literature was introduced to the University of Florence. And also that it's in this time frame is considered to be the first stage of the Italian Renaissance. That period that I'm just explaining to you with all those Aries-orientated historical developments is, as I said before, also the same as the Pisces sub-age, 1253 to 1433. Now, Pisces rules very different archetypes compared to Aries. It is the sign of oceans, major calamities, religious schisms, and Christianity, and also Islam. Just to give you an idea of the calamitous nature of this Pisces, The Black Death swept through Europe in the mid-1300s. Now, no one in modern times could imagine the Black Death. You just think of yourself wherever you live and think that, and look at everyone you know, your family and your friends, and then think that 1 in 3 or 1 in 2 of everyone you knew is going to be dead in 6 weeks. This is what the Black Death did to Europe. It swept through mercilessly and killed many, many people and devastated Europe. Nevertheless, whoever was remaining was still up to the ability to actually capitalize on some of the positive sides of Pisces, which is its oceanic side. And in the early 1400s, Henry the Navigator in Portugal opened the world's first navigational school. Now, the only reason of having a navigational school is to navigate across the oceans. And it was a precursor to the conquest of the oceans that happened later in that century. Now, ages are not limited to Europe. They occur all around the world. And in China, amassed a massive fleet of ships under the Admiral Zheng He, which is not probably pronounced correctly, and he completed a number of groundbreaking voyages to Southeast Asia, India and Africa up till 1434. It's quite notable that in 1434 that it stopped. And it stopped because the Chinese bureaucracy, and bureaucracy is always ruled by Pisces, burnt his fleet to the ground in 1434 and actually commenced China's period of introversion, where it tried to ignore the rest of the world and tried to shut it out. It seemed to be aware unconsciously that the age had changed and they were no longer in the same position as they were prior to this time. And then even in the Roman Catholic Church, you had a great religious schism, which actually saw in between 1378 and 1470 2 popes alive at the same time. Under Aries, the Roman Catholic Church not only went to war with Islam in the Middle East in the Crusades, but also in the Aries sub-age overflow, it went to war with itself. But now, 1433, with the arrival of the Aquarius age, you get this strange situation where the Pisces sub-age goes into its overflow mode. Now, I didn't mention this before, but my research shows that there is almost double the quantity of relatable events in a period, in a sign's overflow period compared to its sign proper. So in a Pisces sub-age, you would expect historical events to appear related to Pisces. But in the Pisces sub-age overflow, you would expect almost twice the intensity of Pisces events associated with the Pisces tsunami. And very quickly, we see this occurred. Basically, if we start talking about Pisces' relationship to the ocean, I mean, it was only a few decades later in 1492 that Columbus discovered the Americas. Vasco da Gama finally reached India by sea in 1498, and then the world was first circumnavigated by Magellan in 1522. Now, these are major historical events associated with the oceans. They cannot be argued with, and here they are, right on time, even though 1433 marks the arrival of the Age of Aquarius. And what else happened in this Pisces sub-age related to Pisces? Well, Pisces, unfortunately, rules slavery. Now, slaves existed before this period, but there was a huge resurgence in slavery because in 1542, the African slave trade commenced to the Americas, and starting off a multi-century period of really ignominy for so-called European civilization. Now, the Pisces sub-age overflow also had its strong religious component. Pisces is strongly related to Christianity and Islam, but Pisces is also represented by the two fish. And the two fish are swimming in opposite directions. And by 1546, Europe had split between the new Protestant religion and the established Roman Catholic religion. And the Lutherans and Protestants had controlled most of Northern Europe by 1546. And this led to the wars of religion, including the Spanish Armada that attempted to invade England in 1588, but was repelled by Sir Francis Drake under Queen Elizabeth I. Also, unfortunately, from around 1450, for the next 200 years, many thousands of people, mainly women, were executed for witchcraft throughout Europe as a continuation of Pisces medievalism. But Pisces does have some positive side, and it has a strong association with the fine arts and with poetry and with music. And so it should become as no surprise that in the Pisces sub-age overflow, the greatest poet the world has ever seen appeared, and that is William Shakespeare, who lived from 1564 to 1616. Now, it may seem unusual, if you think about it, that more people have lived since the time of William Shakespeare than in all the period up to the time of William Shakespeare, yet no one since the time of William Shakespeare is acclaimed to be a better poet than William Shakespeare, which just goes to show you the strength of ages and sub-periods such as sub-ages, that when these peaks appeared, they are not beaten down or they're not eradicated by further developments of modernity. Not everything improves all the time. Also in this Pisces sub-age overflow, we have Michelangelo, who ran from 1475 to 1564. And then, of course, we have Leonardo da Vinci, who lived from 1452 to 1519. Now, Leonardo da Vinci is a very interesting person because he captures both Pisces in the Pisces sub-age overflow and elements of the new Aquarius age that also arrived in 1433. Leonardo da Vinci is known as a painter, sculptor, engineer, architect and scientist, and he's best known for his painting, the Mona Lisa, painted between 1503 and 1507. And I do remember one art historian mentioning that the key element of the Mona Lisa was it is the first depiction artistically of the modern woman. And this is entirely appropriate because now that we are in the Age of Aquarius from 1433 onwards, the Age of Aquarius begins with the Libra age decan that runs all the way through to 2148 next century. And so there has to be an increasing focus on women from the beginning of the Libra age decan. And one of those beginnings is the Mona Lisa. He also did the Last Supper, completed in 1498, which reflected the Piscean spiritual or ascetic qualities of the time. Now, this Pisces sub-age overflow from 1433 to 1612 is identical to the Capricorn sub-age, the first sub-age in the new age of Aquarius. And what does Capricorn rule or associated with? It is a sign of science, logic, time, conservatism and suppression. Now, as I already spoke to you about Leonardo da Vinci, he was designing gliders, parachutes, armoured tanks, town planning techniques, drainage, irrigation and submarines. He was really probably the world's first modern scientist. He was quickly followed by Copernicus. Now Copernicus was born in 1473 and died in 1543, and he proposed that the Earth was not at the centre of the universe, and in fact that the Earth rotated around the Sun, and that the Sun was the centre of our solar system. And he published this in the very year he died. It is believed that he actually received the first copy on his deathbed. This is considered to be one of the most revolutionary scientific developments seen in the world for over 1,000 years, and is indicative not only of the Capricorn sub-age but also the Aquarius age. Very quickly we had the invention of the microscope in 1590 and the telescope around 1605, and these were followed by an avalanche of scientific discovery in mathematics, physics, biology and chemistry. Now Capricorn also rules time, and the modern year was established in 1582 because the previous calendar set up under the Roman Empire was not accurate enough and was slowly getting out of sync with the real year. And so they recreated the year and started the new year in the Julian calendar that we still use today in 1582 in this Capricorn sub-age. And so we should expect a continuation of Capricorn archetypal developments in the Capricorn sub-age overflow that ran from 1612 to 1791. And the Royal Society dedicated to scientific enterprise was formed in London in 1662, followed quickly after by the French Academy of Science in 1673. The Greenwich Observatory opened in 1675, which incidentally therefore allowed the reckoning of Greenwich Mean Time on the longitude that runs through the Greenwich Observatory. And again, we're getting another influence of time associated with a Capricorn period. And by 1752, Benjamin Franklin was experimenting with electricity, just to show you that while Capricorn is making its influence felt, the Age of Aquarius is still making its initial appearance. Now, in the Capricorn sub-age overflow in 1612 to 1791, we saw the growth of European nations with strong central authority, sympathetic to the autocratic political model of the French King Louis XIV. It saw the rise of Great Britain, France, Russia, Austria and Prussia. And all these nations under Capricorn had hierarchical governments with the upper class at the top running the show in a very severe manner. But we don't normally think of music being associated with Capricorn. If anything, we would think music is associated with Libra and Pisces. But Capricorn is the sign of conservatism, and classical music is stated to have arrived by 1750, getting towards the end of this Capricorn sub-age overflow, but definitely the renowned musicians such as Philip and Emanuel Bach, Haydn, Gluck, Mozart, and the early works of Beethoven all appeared in this Capricorn sub-age overflow, appropriately aligned with classical music. Then we have the Protestant work ethic. Now, you know, when you think of Capricorn, you think of this old, severe, authoritarian influence, which the Christians obviously turned into God. And there's God up there, stern, severe, ready to, you know, throw you into hell if you played a musical instrument or went dancing or did something that was frivolous. And John Calvin was at the forefront of this conservative religious revival under Capricorn. John Calvin lived from 1509 to 1564, and out of John Calvin and others of his ilk, the Protestant work ethic appeared, and the harsh, even austere approach to life, the fire and brimstone style that the Puritans took with them America appeared. And this still exists within America today. This is one of the reasons why Americans stand aside from most other modern Western nations in their harsh treatment of healthcare to the poor. Capricorn does not like compassion and Pisces sort of helping people. They want everyone to look after themselves. This same Puritan intolerance under Capricorn was cultivated in England by the stern Lord Protector of England, Oliver Cromwell, who lived from 1599 to 1658, who installed a joyless and harsh arch-conservative Christian social policy upon the English. It's like as if the Taliban came to power and they were, where they were outlawing everything, music and radio and women's education. Well, we had the similar thing happen in the West in this Capricorn time, and Oliver Cromwell brought that in. And the same thing appeared in the Middle East, where the forebears of the current rulers of Saudi Arabia adopted by the mid-1700s the strict and fundamentalist Wahhabism Islamic doctrine that they are still promoting today. That motivates organizations such as the Taliban and ISIS to adopt this stern, arch-conservative approach to religion. The Capricorn sub-age overflow obviously overlaps the new Sagittarius sub-age, 1612 to 1791. Now, Sagittarius is the sign of expansion, including population explosion, long-distance travel and philosophy, amongst other things. What happened in the 1700s in England is that they had an agricultural revolution. The emphasis is not so much on revolution, but on the fact that their agricultural output started to increase tremendously. And whenever we get an increase in economic activity, you get the greater ability to do a lot more things, because now you've got a surplus and that surplus can get invested. And that's what happened. It led into the beginning of the Industrial Revolution at the end of the 1700s. And the 1700s saw a 40% growth in world population compared to an estimated 18% for the preceding century. The Sagittarius sub-age also coincided with the Age of Enlightenment. I should just quickly mention that the Age of Enlightenment, anything with the word light, is always related to Leo. And you must remember that there are 3 sub-age decans in the Sagittarius sub-age, and one of them is Leo. And so if I was doing a talk on sub-age decans, I would be talking of the correlation of the Age of Enlightenment with that Leo sub-age decan. But nevertheless, the Age of Enlightenment also brought in what you could say modern liberal thinking and philosophy. We had Voltaire from 1694 to 1778, followed by Rousseau, 1712 to 1778, and Immanuel Kant from 1724 to 1804. And then the Sagittarius sub-age obviously picks up speed in 1791 when it enters the overflow period that lasted till 1970, within the lifespan of many people who are watching this video, especially baby boomers. The 1800s saw a 71% population increase in Europe. Well, that's massive. And we can honestly say that the exponential population explosion of unprecedented size and nature occurred in this Sagittarian sub-age overflow, never before seen in the world. And obviously, if Sagittarius is associated with philosophy, we should have some famous philosopher. Now, the most famous philosopher, people may not be aware, is actually considered to be Karl Marx. Now, he is obviously denigrated these days because of his associated with that terrible evil of communism, but Karl Marx is considered the greatest philosopher of modern times because he has had the greatest influence upon the world. And still there are many countries in the world that are strongly associated with communism. Sagittarius sub-age period that ran from 1791 to 1970 overlapped with the Scorpio sub-age. Now, Scorpio is a very different sign to Sagittarius. Scorpio is a sign of revolution, tyrants, death, nuclear power and nuclear weapons, criminals and criminal networks, spies and espionage, space travel and cultural upheavals and revolutions in general. And so we had the workers' revolution by the lower classes in Western nations. And this really led to a worldwide revolution in this time frame from 1791 to 1970. Now, what's most interesting that I find about this worldwide revolution is that no one will ever teach you this in school. Because at the beginning of the Scorpio sub-age in 1791, the whole world, nearly the whole world, was run by kings, queens, monarchs and aristocrats. By 1970, basically, they were either all gone or greatly diminished in stature, such as like the English monarchy. This revolution, this worldwide massive revolution where the monarchs were thrown out and were replaced by either democracies or totalitarianism or communism, was a massive revolution that you would expect to be associated with the sign Scorpio. And also associated with that, we had the greatest murderous tyrants possibly the world's ever seen. Probably seen more others in other times in history, but certainly in recent memory, and very few come anywhere close to the Stalin and Hitler. Obviously in this time we had the harnessing of nuclear energy for military and energy needs. We also had the first stage of the exploration of space with the first man on the moon in 1969, only 1 year before the peak of Scorpio. We also had the rise of criminal organisations such as the mafia triads, and what's the commonality is that they're underground, and that's what Scorpio likes. And even we had the growth of spies and espionage, and even by the end of this Scorpio sub-age, James Bond was the most major fictional spy in the world. Now, we actually enter into current times, because if the Scorpio sub-age came to an end in 1970, that means that the Scorpio sub-age overflow commences in 1970 and runs all the way to 2148 in the middle of next century. Now, Scorpio is also associated with sex, pollution, recycling, terrorism, death, including assassination, the death penalty, euthanasia, longevity, and minimalism. We have the sexual revolution that began in the 1960s, which included the appearance of birth control and the slow legalization of abortion. Sexuality also includes homosexuality, transvestites, and pedophiles, and all of these have even been in the news strongly lately, either through the legalization of same-sex marriage, homosexuality, and the appearance and court cases against all the pedophiles in the churches and youth organisations that have occurred in the last few decades. We had the appearance of AIDS first identified in 1981, and then we get the internet. Now, many people have a problem with associating the internet with Scorpio, but Scorpio rules minimalism. Scorpio is opposite the sign of Taurus. Under Taurus we had the Stonehenge and the Great Pyramids of Egypt. Taurus is the sign of solid matter. And so Scorpio lacks this quality. And so basically the internet is really just dots on a screen in the end of the day. We also had the New Age movement that grew out of the unrest of the 1960s and early 70s. We had the formation of Greenpeace in 1971, which indicates the growing environmental consciousness or awareness of many people. Related, obviously, to another aspect of Scorpio is pollution. Now, many astrologers just look dumbfounded when they think of pollution related to to Scorpio, but pollution is just the excrement of the world, and that excrement is ruled by Scorpio. We've had the appearance of postmodernism under this Scorpio sub-age overflow, which places an emphasis not on how everything is great and how the economy is expanding and the buildings are getting bigger and everything's improving. It's related more to skepticism and the perils of the modern economic miracle. One of the side effects of the modern economic miracle is climate change and worldwide pollution that we're experiencing now. And it's a major problem, and the Scorpio sub-age overflow indicates it's not going away in a hurry. We've got genetic engineering, including genetically modified foods. Anything to do with genetics has to do with sex, has to do with Scorpio. We had contemporary terrorist activity beginning in this period, especially with the airplane hijackings in the early 1980s. Since the 1970s, we've got a proliferation of nuclear reactors for power, with a huge resurgence in recent years. This analysis of sub-ages at the end of the age of Pisces and at the beginning of the age of Aquarius is not a definitive research or explanation of these sub-ages. I actually have commenced researching these sub-ages in earnest for my second book, and I've almost completed the fire sub-ages. In other words, I have recently researched and documented the Aries, Leo and Sagittarius sub-ages commencing around 3000 BC, and even going back for earlier examples. Now, if you want to find more details on these sub-ages, you can go to my blog called Demystifying the Aquarian Age at WordPress, and I will have some more information on that in the credits at the end of this video. Now, I just want to quickly state that there is a very relevant aspect to this research related to the fact that at the end of the age of Pisces and the beginning of the age of Aquarius, there is a missing Aquarian sub-age. Because if you think about it, we go from the Aries sub-age to the Pisces sub-age, but instead of then going to the Aquarius sub-age, we've jumped to the Capricorn sub-age and then the Sagittarius sub-age and so on. This is due to a quirk of dwads or dwadasamsas. It's the way they are set up, that there is always this discontinuity, and so it was quite critical for me to find this missing Aquarius sub-age, because then it told me that what I had found wasn't the cusp of any ages, it was the cusp of the Pisces and Aquarian ages, because it's only at that cusp between the age of Pisces and the age of Aquarius that the missing Aquarius sub-age can occur. And it was rather speculative of me in the first place to apply dwads to ages. Most astrologers probably are not even aware of dwads, let alone using them, but I had a rather strange apprenticeship in astrology. I didn't really know any other astrologers and didn't really get involved in any astrological organizations for the first 15 years and even more of my life as a student astrologer. And in 1973, when I'd only been studying astrology for a few years, I read an article about dwads and how they could be used extensively in Western astrology. However, if this approach of using dwads to ages and sub-ages was irrelevant, I would have thrown them aside and looked at some other way. Now, I also should just quickly mention that when I was lining up my 2 sheets of cardboard with all the sub-ages marked in scale in one and the historical events in the other, and I said they all click together, it was not as simple as that, because even though they kind of all click together, the main sub-age and historical correlation that clicked was the Aries sub-age with the Renaissance. If you study books on history, the Renaissance is almost like a fist coming out of the pages. It is such a period of such high energy. And there is a very good reason for this, though I didn't know this at the time, is that the Aries sub-age is almost at the end, and its overflow is at the end of the age of Pisces. But the age of Pisces is also the Aries age overflow. And so this little Aries sub-age, related to the Renaissance, was actually resonating with the whole overflow energy from the age of Aries, the same energy that powered the Roman Empire. And so you would expect that under the reappearance of this heightened energy of Aries, that there should be something that would stimulate the old Roman Empire. And that's why the Renaissance occurred in Italy, and that's why the urban Renaissance before that also occurred in Italy. Italy, at that stage, about 800 years ago, was really at the forefront of Europe as far as its economic success, its resurgence of cultures and urban living and universities. And when I studied the Renaissance in detail, that's where I had a major epiphany with the overflow effect. I learnt about the overflow effect because historians all said that what we know as the Renaissance had seeds a century or more before that. And it was this seed that gathered my interest or took my interest. And I discovered that this applied to all sub-ages, that the sub-age has a seed for something, and then in the sub-age overflow, it tends to get expanded upon or developed. And so the Aries sub-age showed me a lot. That's the conclusion of this video. It's rather a brief approach to trying to convince anyone that the Age of Aquarius arrived in the 15th century. But I thank you for watching this video and taking attention. And I'm sure that if you study it any further, you will find confirmation that the Age of Aquarius did arrive in the 15th century, and even more specifically in 1433. Thank you very much.